Thank you for that. I mean, let's move a little bit more to the West now and talk a little bit about Islam in the Americas. And you know, before Columbus discovered America and got helped into America, maybe talk a little bit about how Islam spread to the Americas before that.
SubhanAllah, Bismillah. Indeed, I mean, I think we all know now that it's an open or hidden. It's not anymore hidden. It's open knowledge now that Christopher Columbus was not the first one to discover America. Many others had arrived on the continents, and especially in the Caribbean, and amongst them even Vikings. The Vikings are known having been in Greenland and all the way to the north of the continent. So no secret again about this. But Christopher Columbus was the one who claimed, to have put the flag, the Spanish flag or the European side, that suddenly this belongs to Europe. This is part of Spain. This is part of Europe. So that was something that Christopher Columbus did. That does not mean that everybody before him was not there. It's just simply that they didn't claim. They didn't have this kind of claims. So no Muslim from Al-Andalus, no Muslim from the West African Empire, such as the Mali Empire, no Viking even, and nobody else who ever arrived in America ever had this claim that this is ours. And this is what makes it very different. So Christopher Columbus made it into the history books as being the discoverer of America simply because of this terrifying claim. And to be very honest, as a European, I think I can say that. One thing that really I find, how can I, let me think carefully, phrase my words. Something that I find obnoxious and maybe a little bit irritating when you deal with European history in Europe is that Europeans have always claimed something that was never theirs. If you look at Europeans having traveled the world and so-called exploring and discovering the world long before them, everything else had happened, by the way. Nowadays, we have the whole of America speaking actually European languages, from English to Spanish, from French to Portuguese. So the real languages in America don't exist anymore. The indigenous people barely exist anymore. The same in Australia and in many other places where Europeans have been. Whereas before these Europeans, others had been there and that never happened. Massacres and genocides in that way never happened before the Europeans actually in these places.
Yeah, it leads us into this concept of the Eurocentric view of the world. We'll talk about that at a different point. It's a big topic, but we're talking to Adnan Rashid the other day, and the Dark Ages was not the Dark Ages for the world. It was the Dark Ages for Europe. Exactly. Europe was the one that was in the Dark Ages, and it seems like that was the history of the world.
And then again, Christian Europe, because during the so-called Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, Al-Andalus was flourishing. Al-Andalus was the Muslim part of Europe, which is Spain, Portugal, France. So yes, but with regards to America, there were Muslims from Al-Andalus, Muslims from that time Al-Andalus, Muslims from West Africa, the Mali Empire. Many of us might have heard of Mansa Musa. Many of these Muslim kings and emperors of that time had actually sent out ships already to the Americas. Many of them were even trading with them. And you can find, again, these elements. It's not something that I came up with. These are facts nowadays that you can rediscover if you want to, that actually Muslims had already been trading from Africa especially, but also from Al-Andalus, with indigenous people in the Americas, that even indigenous people in the Americas had accepted the faith, that there were contracts signed even later with the Spaniards and with the Portuguese, which started with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And there are enough museums nowadays in the States, for example, you can find Islamic museums or museums that actually show you the contracts signed between the Spanish and the Portuguese invaders and the indigenous people with the start Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is amazing. This is absolutely amazing. The same Australia, by the way. Australia, in the northern territories of Australia, were once actually inhabited by Aborigines, of course, by the indigenous Australians, but also Muslim Aborigines. So there were villages in the northern territories that had contact with Indonesian Muslims. I mean, if you look at Indonesia, the geography, you see clearly that the Indonesian islands are very close to Australia in the north. And the northern territories of Australia had actually Muslim villages, and a lot of them. It was just one or two. But one Captain Cook, who arrived then, British explorer or whatever he was, when he arrived in Australia, these Muslim villages were the first ones that actually people were massacred there, and they don't exist anymore. But we do have nowadays evidence, and there is a museum in Australia which has come up recently with these facts, and which anybody should visit, actually, whoever can. So yeah, there we go. I mean, Islam in the West is not something that came recently in the 1900s through migration and migration waves as we know them in America or in Australia. No, not at all. It was actually present long before, and there were not some kind of paupers who came over to the West. Most of them were rulers, were emperors, were Muslims who had a certain saying in the world.
Great, fantastic. Really appreciate that. Maybe tell us a little bit more about this connection between Europe and the Americas and Islam. If you have a little bit more on that.
Bismillah. Yeah, I mean, first of all, there is a connection between Africa and Europe and the Americas, and Africa and the Americas, of course. I mean, these three continents are very closely linked with regards to Islam. We should not forget that the very first hijrah, the very first refuge, actually, of the Muslims was in Africa. In Africa. So the very first ruler who we all know, and Najashi, from Habasha, Abyssinia, Ethiopia at that time, or the Horn, rather the Horn, because Ethiopia didn't exist. It was rather the Abyssinia. So the Horn of Africa and the ruler of the Horn of Africa, Najashi, accepted the faith. This makes him the very first ruler who was not an Arab. So the very first ruler to accept Islam was an African and not an Arab. So where Islam spread first was not Arabia, but Africa. Might have heard, we have come across the Sira and we've read something, but have we really stood still? Have we ever really realized that actually the deen spread first in Africa before it's actually spread in Arabia? So that in itself is amazing. So Africa was an open continent to Islam, and it went through East Africa also to North and Central Africa. From North Africa, it went, of course, to Al-Andalus, which was the Iberian Peninsula, which the Muslims actually established in 711 until 1492. This is like 700 to 800 years of Islamic presence in Europe, Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus was the geographical area of Spain and Portugal, as well as a certain part of France, but also chronologically between 711 and 1492, the Muslims opened also other countries, such as nowadays Italy, the island of Sicily, the island of Malta, Crete, Cyprus, France, and Switzerland. So all these countries were actually part of the Muslim empire in one time or the other, okay? And the Muslims there were established rulers. They were not some kind of, as I said, some kind of immigrants or something. They were established rulers. We had Swiss Muslims, we had French Muslims, Spanish, Portuguese Muslims. We have scholars coming from that part of the world. So in the end, the connection between Africa and Europe is very close with regards to Islam. And from there, we have descriptions of Muslims from Al-Andalus having reached the Americas. The same Muslims from the Mali Empire having reached the Caribbean and the Americas and doing trade. So there you see how Africa and Europe go together, how Africa and Europe also influence the Americas, but in a positive way this time, before Christopher Columbus came and before the European colonialists came, actually. So the influence that the Europeans had on the Americas before the arrival of the Christian Europeans, actually, Muslims were there before, and they influenced America in a totally different way than the Christians who came later, who imposed Christianity on the Europeans, on the Americans, who actually massacred people and who disregarded indigenous people in that part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's, this whole indigenous topic is another one that's dear and true to my heart specifically. We in Canada there was huge, massive mass graves that were found of children and that were basically killed in these schools. They call them basically reforming them, taking the native out of them. But it's quite sad as to what happened in that whole era. So moving on just a little bit into the not